Okay, there we go. We've started the recording. Welcome everyone to Crucifixion of the King of Glory, chapter 21 and 22 discussion. We've already said the prayer, and I kind of forgot about the recording, so we're jumping in with that now. So as we usually do, let's kind of go on the table and see if anyone has something particularly that they want to make sure we talk about before we finish our conversation tonight. So if anybody has anything, please share that. If not, we can just jump right into the discussion. Okay, very good. So let's do that. Let's start with the chapter 21. This one I ended up actually listening to like 3 or 4 times just because I found it really interesting. There was a lot of detail here, and I read it too. But I've been kind of living in my car recently, and this was a good thing to listen to. So we've got Ken jumping on here now too. So chapter 21 sort of talks about, it's called the sentencing. So we're talking about the Lord's sentencing here. We haven't quite gotten to his death, or right at the very end, we talk a little bit about him being crucified. But in any case, the sentencing. And then chapter 22, we talk about crucifixion a lot, which I found surprisingly kind of interesting. Maybe, who knows why, but I think there's a lot of interesting information there, maybe because I first studied history, but in any case. Okay, so I think the key piece is like the second or third sentence. The religious authorities finally expressed the true reason they had condemned Jesus to death. He claimed to be God. So if you remember, in the last chapter, chapter 20, we talked about Pilate a lot and kind of his position, how guilty he was of what happened there, and so on and so forth. A little bit more light. There we go. And so I think that now we get to kind of what was happening more maybe with the crowd, with the Jewish authorities and the Jewish crowd that they had been able to get together. And so the Jews answered him, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die because he made himself a son of God." When Pilate heard these words, he was the more afraid. He entered the praetorium again and said, "Jesus, where are you from?" So Pilate is afraid. He's afraid because he has this feeling that Jesus Christ might be God. And we read a little bit farther on about the Roman literature and their sort of practice of having gods disguised as men who come to earth. And then when people treat them not as gods, they end up getting punished. So this was apparently well known in the Roman times, this sort of genre of literature. And so Pilate, being an educated person, would have been very familiar with it. And so it was very easy for him to slip into that sort of paradigm of, okay, maybe he's hiding as a god, and then I will be punished because I treated him not as a god, but as a human. So this is sort of the whole context, I would say, of at least the vast majority of this chapter and what's happening at this point in the history of our salvation. So she notes on page 200 that the Roman governor had every right to release an accused person. And then, in fact, she noted this situation which that happened with someone else who's named Jesus. Jesus is Joshua, right? That's the same exact word, right? So in English, we use we say Joshua, but Jesus and Joshua is the same name, okay? So another Jesus who came 30 years later that the Jews turned over to the Romans, the governor of Palestine at that point, he let him go. So it's clear that that's well within their ability to do that. And moreover, this depiction of Pilate in the Gospels, where the sort of modern protagonists against Christianity sort of say, well, they were just trying to impress the Romans or tried to make them happy. Actually, Pilate's depiction in the Gospels is very anti-Roman, right? His uncertainty, his reluctance to use violence, all of this was very anti-Roman. They expected from their leaders that there would be justice, it would be swift, and it would be violent. And that's how they kept themselves in charge of a massive empire for so many centuries, because they were very swift with their justice, whether we considered it justice or not, they did. And they were very violent in their application of that justice, and they ruled essentially by fear. So all of this hemming and hawing and trying to find a way to release Jesus and all of this, where the modern sort of critiques of Christianity say, well, that was just the early Christians trying to make the Romans look good. They've themselves fallen into the trap of judging one historical epoch by another, thinking that because they have that thought, that must have been the thought then. It's actually the opposite. Pilate is not depicted in a way that Romans would find heroic by any means. He's depicted in a way that they actually would find anti-heroic, anti-Roman, way too soft, way too unsure of himself, way too hesitating about applying justice. So anyway, I think that's an interesting dichotomy and not an unimportant one when we live in an era kind of extreme skepticism as regards to faith. So anyway, something I think very interesting for us. On page 201, she talks about the fact that Pilate was genuinely alarmed by the possibility that Jesus Christ was a God and that he was hiding among men as a man. And because he understood, as we talked about it in the first, that this sort of genre of Roman literature, the way it works out is the person who mistreated the god, even though he couldn't tell he was a god, was always punished by that god. So he was afraid. So then she goes through a couple of reasons why Pilate wanted to release Jesus. First, he was not a threat to the general order. So what do they care? He can talk about whatever he wants. The Romans wanted order. They didn't care about other religions and so on and so forth. Second, Jesus did not commit any Roman crime. I think that's a really important piece here. The Romans might have been harsh, but they were not abjectly unjust as a rule. If someone didn't commit a crime, they weren't going to punish them. Maybe they might, cause that person to be punished a little bit for the sake of the society, but they were not going to kill somebody for not committing any Roman crimes. And then his third reason that he might want to release him is because he thought he just might be a god. However, because of Christ's approach to Pilate, it was so unusual for Pilate that someone would be calm, peaceful, would answer rationally instead of begging for their life or trying to justify what they had done or claiming that they were completely innocent. Christ had such a different approach to the interaction with this governor, who was also the supreme judge in a worldly sense of what was happening in his province, that it really took him aback. But he was on one hand shocked by that, but other times he got upset by that, right? So when he asked Jesus where he's from and Jesus didn't reply, he got upset with that. He forgot that, well, maybe he's a god, because that was so unusual. People didn't refuse to talk to him. They were ready to beg for their lives from him. So this, I think, is something interesting, the sort of real dichotomy of what's going on there between Christ as a prisoner and everyone else that Pilate would have dealt with. So I think a very interesting piece there. And that no one had ever dared to speak with him in that way. Where first Christ was silent, and then he says to him, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me has the greater sin." There's a little conversation that she goes through about who does that mean? Who is the one who delivered him who has the greater sin? And it seems that the vast majority of the fathers and the scholars note that that's Caiaphas. Sometimes people think Judas, but the sort of, not that it's a democracy, but there's more people who sort of think that it's Caiaphas than Judas. So that's, I think, very interesting piece as well. Okay, but Pilate is reluctant. He's not being very Roman about this whole thing. And then they sort of put him in a corner where he is coerced and he has no choice, or he thinks he has no choice. So he already had the title friend of Caesar. And she makes it clear that the news about the rebellion in Rome, which was supposedly led by the person who was Pilate's sponsor in the political arena, that person was executed publicly in Rome for having revolted against Caesar, although honestly it's really not clear that he did. But in any case, Caesar felt that he did, and when you're Caesar, you get to do what you want. And that person and his sort of contemporaries were executed publicly in Rome. And so that put Pilate into a bad situation in that his sort of sponsor, his protector, was gone. And so now he's put in this situation by the Jewish authorities where they say, we have no other king but Caesar, and if you don't kill this other pretender king, then you're not Caesar's friend. So that use of the word Caesar's friend, it was actually a title. It was an aristocratic title that someone could have, and certainly Pilate was a high enough ranking person that he would have had that title. So there's a big fat irony there going on, that the Jews are sort of, who are about to commemorate this deliverance from Egypt, deliverance from slavery. They are in fact delivering God, who had delivered them. They're delivering God to death, right? And they're using this friend of Caesar thing against Pilate, who's in a very precarious political situation, at least potentially, because his sponsor had been killed as a revolutionary. And so, of course, he was looked at with skepticism now. And in fact, if you remember, he was on his way back, not for this, but later on he had been accused of inappropriately killing some Samaritans. And he was on his way back to Rome to stand trial for that when Tiberius Caesar died. And therefore, nothing ever happened to Pilate about that. So he was in a somewhat precarious situation. And when they were, the Jewish priests were crying out and saying, if you we have no king but Caesar, and if you don't destroy this pretender king, then you are not Caesar's friend. So all of these things are going on, and if we don't understand that, then it's a little less clear why it is that all of a sudden Pilate was like, okay, like, I don't want to kill him. I don't see that he broke any law, but I'm going to crucify him. Like, it seems like this random thing that falls from the sky. He's over here, and all of a sudden now he's over here, and it has everything to do with that his political situation in the Roman Empire was a bit precarious, maybe a lot precarious. We don't really know that much detail, but we know that his sponsor was killed as a revolutionary in Rome, and that certainly put him in a bad situation. So that's what's happening. And as soon as the Jewish priests start to and the crowd start to shout that if you don't kill him, you're not a friend of Caesar, that was the end. And he said, all right, so we crucify him. He washed his hands, signifying that he was innocent. But it was Roman soldiers who did this. It was not the Jews that crucified Christ. I mean, they didn't nail him to the cross. They didn't, do those things. Those were done by Roman soldiers. But Pilate tries to show that he's innocent by washing his hands in front of the crowd. And she notes that it was important, not just for the Jews, but also for the pagans to not be guilty of killing someone who's innocent. So that, I think, is a really interesting piece there too. Okay, so we get to the point where Pilate can't resist anymore, and he decides that he has to crucify Jesus now. But he's been humiliated by the Jewish leaders into doing this. This is not because he wanted to, but because he got painted into a corner by them. So he was essentially extorted by them to do this. And so what he did was he started to humiliate them as they had humiliated him. So he says, behold your king, and so on and so forth. And we have this famous, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said, shall I crucify your king? Like this is right out of Holy Friday Madness. Everybody knows this, I think. And this is where they say we have no king but Caesar, which of course is a huge blasphemy. They rejected God, even though they were about to celebrate God's saving them from slavery. So it's really a lot of irony going on, and I think that that's important for us. And we should pause there just for a second to say that in the scriptures, irony is used a lot. It's probably the favorite rhetorical device. Does that mean it's God's favorite rhetorical device? I don't know, but it's certainly in the scriptures, by far, irony is the most used. Irony, hypocrisy, which is a form of irony. This is everywhere in the scriptures because it points out very viscerally, very clearly what's right and wrong. We understand irony very well. It's something that really hits us, and that's the point of a rhetorical device, is to get us to pay attention, to understand what is the truth behind the rhetoric. And so this great irony that the Jews are delivering Christ, even on the day when they're celebrating his delivering them from slavery in Egypt, this is not random. This is there to remind us that of the good that God does for us, and the bad that he is often repaid by his people. So I think that's very interesting. And then we have this conversation about the blood curse, which I think is actually important. People often misunderstand this, and so I want to just take a minute to go over it. So at this point, Pilate says, all right, well, see to it yourself. You crucify him. And of course, they said, well, we can't crucify him. That's not, you don't give us that right, and that's not according to our law. We don't crucify. There were only 4 ways in which the Jews could kill: stoning, hanging. I forgot the other ones. We'll get to them eventually, but none of those were crucifixion. That was not allowed for them to do. And so we have this conversation where he says, you crucify him. No. We don't want to crucify him. And they have this conversation where eventually it ends up the Jews saying, let his blood be upon us and upon our children. Now you would be surprised how often a priest has to deal with this specific instance. I would say many times per year. I have to have a conversation with people about the understanding that the church has about whether their sins affect their children. Because people take this and think that, okay, the Jews did that, that must therefore be right. That must be the way that God works. And therefore, when I do something bad, it affects my children in a spiritual way. Now, what I usually tell people is, first of all, that's not the way the church, that's not what the church teaches. The church teaches that we all stand on our own. We all stand on our own in relation to our spiritual lives. That being said, if we're constantly sinning, we are going to affect our children because we're going to teach them to sin. We're going to teach them that sin is normalized and that this is something which is fine and good. But it's not that our sin, that they suffer for our sins. No, each man stands alone before God regarding his sins. But certainly if we're sinning all the time, we're teaching our kids to sin. They're not cursed by our sin, but they're taught to sin. Okay, so Linda asks, first you had your hand up, but then you typed it, so I assume this is your question. Then why are the Jews called the chosen people? Because God chose them from all peoples in the time of Abraham to be his people. And they had their this pact where they would follow God and he would protect them and he would guide them to the promised land, which of course means salvation. To them, they didn't understand it in that way. So they were chosen by God in that way. But it doesn't mean that once they reject God that they remain chosen by him. Do they have some special blessings? Do they have some like residual of that in their lives? I can't say absolutely no. There are certain things that you can point to. But actually, what's interesting is because in the Christian epoch, we don't really think of like success, worldly success, as something that would be considered a blessing from God. Whereas in this first century, definitely both the Romans and the Jews unquestionably did think that way. If you were materially blessed, therefore that meant that God blessed you. Whereas in the Christian epoch, we would say that actually that's something we have to be careful about, because God often blesses those who reject him. Why? Because he loves everyone. He wants everyone to have some good. And if someone is going to have a terrible afterlife, if they're going to suffer in the afterlife for the way they live their life here, then sometimes he rewards them here materially so that they won't suffer both here and in the afterlife. So we look at it completely differently in our days, in the Christian epoch. And to say that the Jews are the chosen people after having rejected God, I think that's not the Orthodox way to look at it. I think there's a lot of Protestants that look at it that way. They have this weird idea that if the stronger Israel is, the more likely they can make Jesus Christ return a second time, like faster. That like man has something Man has something to do with that. Of course, we have nothing to do with that. That's all on God's time. So I hope that answers your question, Linda. And I saw your email about your son getting married, and I promised to reply to that. And congratulations. I just saw the title. So anyway, but I will answer that. Okay. So yes, it's a very popular belief. It is a very popular belief, but it's very Protestant, and actually, it's not very mainline Protestant. It's very evangelical. It's something like the rapture. Like this is something which is a very, very modern belief. It's not an ancient belief by any means, and it's definitely like an evangelical kind of thing that you don't find that in any place before the mid 19th century and even later. Okay, so I hope that I answered your question. Then Lori says she uses the term elect, and if you could point me out to that, I'd like to just see the context of it. It may be the same kind of idea, but I would say that we would go to the many are called but few are chosen understanding of the church, and that is when the Lord says many are called but few are chosen. Many means all. Few are chosen are those who choose. Not that God chose some and didn't choose others. After Jesus Christ, all of that Hebrew stuff, it's all gone. Like it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter what tribe you come from. It doesn't matter if you're one of the 12 tribes of Israel, if you're some weird Germanic tribe, or even a Slav. Everyone has the opportunity for the heavenly kingdom. So many are called, but few are chosen. It's many are called means all. Everyone's called to the heavenly kingdom, and few are chosen means you choose. You get to choose if you go to the heavenly kingdom, not someone else. There's not an outside force. So I hope that answers the question, Lori. And if it doesn't, please clarify. Okay, so St. John Chrysostom she quotes St. John Chrysostom about the blood libel of the Jews on their children, and I think that's very important to understand. We do not pass on some curse to our children if we sin, but we do teach them to sin. And that's something bad, but that is not like some kind of spiritual residual that goes to them. So I hope that helps. She points out also towards the end of that 21st chapter that Chrysostom had no patience, no sympathy for Pilate. He said he was, a person who had every opportunity to do the right thing, and he chose not to. Especially, he chose not to when it just had to do with his personal power. Like he did not go to a higher plane, to a higher concept, and tried to do what was right. He only with power. Finally, in chapter 21, she talks about the 6th hour. There's a prayer for each of the hours, 1st, 3rd, 6th, and 9th. We probably hear that prayer of the 6th hour. We've probably heard it thousands of times in our lives because it's read every Sunday when we're preparing for the Divine Liturgy. We finish up the 6th hour, and then we begin the Divine Liturgy. And so the prayer of the 6th hour talks about when that on the 6th hour Jesus Christ was condemned. So listen to that carefully next time. The 3rd hour talks about some other part of Jesus Christ's life, and so on and so forth. So these prayers at the end of the hours correspond to the life of Jesus Christ. We hear those, as I said, the 3rd and 6th, we hear them on every Sunday before Divine Liturgy and before any other Divine Liturgy. The 1st is read after Vigil, or after Mass, and the 9th is the least used service probably in the entire church in parish life, because that comes before Vespers. I don't know any, actually I do know one parish that does that, but one out of every parish in the world that reads 9th hour before Vespers on weekdays. We hear that really only during Great Lent, right before the pre-sanctified liturgy. We often hear the prayer of the 9th hour. So anyway, those are interesting, and I'll find those. Well, I know you have where to find them. I just don't have any books with me because I'm on vacation. Or maybe even Ken, who joined the call and didn't think that I would ask him to do any homework. Maybe he can send those prayers of the 1st, 3rd, 6th, and 9th hours to the group. I think it would be very interesting. Okay, so that's we make a turn now after the 21st.
Do you want me to post that? Is that the
Maybe I send it to an email to the group.
Oh, okay, sure.
That group email is wide open. Like there's no filter on it, so anybody can send. If you send it, it'll go to the whole group. Okay,
sounds good.
Good, thank you, Ken. So we after the 21st chapter, we head to the 22nd, and that begins part 3, the cross. Okay, so we talk a lot here, and as I said, I thought this was super interesting. Like I don't know why, probably everybody thinks I'm crazy, but it just seemed really interesting to all of this discussion about crucifixion. Maybe I'm thinking about that in light of the Gladiator movie. I'm not sure. Where, if you remember, the general Maximus, his wife and son were crucified, and he returned to his farm to find them there, like that. So maybe that's why. I'm not sure. But in any case, let's get into this because this I think is quite interesting. So Cicero described crucifixion as the cruelest and most disgusting penalty. Crucifixion literally means fixed to a cross, and it was specifically designed to be painful, slow, and humiliating. Right? Soldiers and citizens of Rome were generally killed in a very specific way. It had to do with a sword right at the base of your neck, which severed your spinal cord, and so your death was both quick and completely painless because that had happened to you. Now we think of that as like totally barbaric. I get that, but there was a specific way that citizens of Rome were killed, and it was the farthest thing from crucifixion. So I think that's important for us to understand that this was the case. Now, she points out a few places where this was, where crucifixion was practiced outside of Rome. All interesting, but she notes that probably the Romans learned this from the Carthaginians. If you know the history of Rome, you know that they are like, until the Persians, the Carthaginians were Rome's greatest foil, right? They were at war with them. I can't remember for how long. They were the ones who brought the elephants over the Alps, famously, and so on and so forth. Like this was a real enemy of Rome. Like I said, the greatest enemy surely until Persia. So anyway, the fact that they learned that from the Carthaginians is not surprising, and she says, you know, from whom the Romans likely learned it. Not that I know more than her, but like I would, if I had to bet, I'd bet on the Carthaginians. That being said, Romans and Greeks both considered that this was a barbaric punishment, like literally from barbarians. So I think this is an important piece for us. When it says that crucifixion is for slaves and barbarians, that's just saying the same thing twice, essentially, in the Roman mind. Slaves are barbarians. Yeah, other people could be enslaved. It's possible. But generally, slaves came from the conquered peoples. And Romans considered anybody who wasn't a Roman to be a barbarian. It essentially meant not Roman. Like we might think, okay, Germans are barbarians, you know, and maybe those Vikings were barbarians, okay, but we don't think of people like from England and Spain as barbaric peoples. They did. Anybody who wasn't a Roman was a barbarian, especially if they were in Europe and not a Roman. The Africans, they had slightly different approach to, but in any case, this was a penalty for the worst of society, which were slaves, which were property, and they didn't consider them to really even be people. Now, what's interesting is that the Romans considered themselves to be these models of nobility, distinction, justice, but this was completely incongruous with the way that they ran their empire, which was just by violence, was just simply by violence and fear. So they think of themselves as very noble, but the way they ran their empire was incredibly base, just fear and violence. So we have this interesting quote from Hengel that she also quotes: "Crucifixion was so abominable that very few literary descriptions of it exist. Like, people just didn't even want to write it down. And that virtually everyone had witnessed crucifixion because it was meant to be a public spectacle and to be demeaning. This was the whole point of the crucifixion. Therefore, there was no description necessary." Very interesting. Very, very interesting, I think. The purpose was always to subject the individual to the greatest possible degree of pain and humiliation, and it was reserved for the lowest offenders in society, those who did not deserve to die with even a shred of dignity. Moreover, Romans, one of their great fears regarding death and the afterlife was that someone would not, that you might die and not be buried. This for them was a big deal. Like, we probably don't think much about that anymore in our days of cremation. But nonetheless, that for a Roman, that was a big deal, that they would not be buried. And those who were crucified were generally not buried. They were not buried because they were left for the wild animals to consume their flesh after they had died on the cross. So for the Romans, this was the supreme punishment. There were other bad punishments like burning to death and so on and so forth, but crucifixion was considered the supreme punishment. Also, this was true of the Jews. It was considered the supreme punishment and was considered a curse. Also, we read in Deuteronomy, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but yeah, this was a really big deal. Roman citizens could not be subjected to crucifixion. I understand there is a footnote there that says at the end of the empire, they began to use crucifixion occasionally on citizens, but that was an extreme deviation from the law that of Rome, that you even a Roman citizen couldn't be beaten without a trial. Like, of course, we think, well, the court, that's just in our eyes. Of course, that's just that someone couldn't be punished at all without a trial. That was nothing for the Romans to just beat somebody or scourge someone, but a Roman citizen couldn't be without a trial. So they had like a lot of rights, whereas the people that they had subjected were essentially slaves. Yeah, by the time of the first century Palestine, there were Jews who became Roman citizens, but it was about 20% of the Jewish population. Very unusual. Yeah, very unusual. St. Paul was, but it was very, very unusual. Okay, so let's see. Yes, there's this little discussion I think interesting about how there was always a place outside of the Roman cities where they would crucify people. Why outside? So that everyone who came to the city and everyone who was in the city who had to go out to do business or farm or anything like that, they saw those people there. It was to put fear into the hearts of the population so that they would obey, so that they would do as they were told. And we think of Rome often, people will say, well, it was a democracy. There were democratic parts. Roman citizens had the right to vote for the Senate, for instance. But sometimes it was a republic where the Senate had more power and the emperor was like just a chief executive. Other times the emperor had the power and the Roman Senate was just a sort of a group that would advise the emperor. But surely there was never a time where everybody who lived in the Roman Empire had a vote. That was, I mean, they would just laugh at that. It was only citizens who could do that. Oh, Ken's already sending the prayers. Great, thank you. So anyway, I think that's important to understand that there was always a place. Oh, good, thank you. There was always a place outside of every Roman city, and you knew you were outside the Roman city because you were outside the ramparts, right? City in those days meant a place that was walled and defended, right? And outside the city didn't have any defense. So you outside the walls, just as it talks about in Christ's crucifixion, outside the walls of the city, there was a place where the criminals were crucified, and that was to give everybody the opportunity to see that and smell that as they came in and out of the city. Okay. Good. I'm just looking for a couple of other things that we should really pay attention to. It's interesting. At the end of the empire, everyone was given citizenship. So they had a different concept of citizenship began to change. Like everyone who physically lived in the empire was given citizenship, but the punishments were still completely based on social class. So they were based on social class during the time of Christ, and even as the empire began to fall apart, it still was based on social class, even if everyone was a citizen there. So, like, I think the best explanation, she wrote, a slave who reported his master for treason might be praised and rewarded for loyalty to the state, and subsequently crucified for being an informant, right? Or like if a slave and her owner were in a work together to kill someone, the owner would, uh, if you own slaves, you were a person of distinction. You were certainly a citizen, almost certainly a citizen. She might receive a kind of slap on the wrist, maybe an exile from Rome for a year or something like that, whereas the slave who committed the same crime would be crucified. So this was always the way that the Romans did it. And this was true even when, at the end of the empire, in kind of a desperate move to keep the empire together, they gave everyone citizenship. They still continued to punish in exactly the same way, even if everyone was a citizen. So that's the only time the citizens were crucified, is when everyone was a citizen. Okay. Right, and then she talks about the social stigma of the cross, that if for some reason someone was crucified, they had the status of a slave. Even if they were crucified and they weren't a slave, they got that status. And they used to crucify people in the nude, but not in Palestine, because that was offensive to the Jews. Interesting. But it was all meant to humiliate. It was all meant to humiliate the person and to make them die slowly and painfully, so that those who saw that would not want to have that happen to them, and therefore they would obey the Roman overlords. Okay. I think interesting, although it might not seem that exciting to you, this couple of paragraphs on page 218 where it talks about Cicero and how he's talking about how one of his enemies, he derived so much pleasure from the loss of his enemy's reputation, as much as he would have if his enemy had been physically tortured or even killed. That shows a lot into the Roman culture and the Roman concept of what's honorable and what's not, and what's important and what's not. Honor was very, very important for them, is the most important thing. And if we don't understand that, then it's kind of hard to understand everything that's happening around Christ's crucifixion, why the Jews wanted Christ crucified, and why the Romans used that crucifixion to debase and demean and to put fear into the people that they ruled over. All right, so as she notes, then crucifixion is not a Jewish penalty, although they occasionally used it, and by occasionally, I would say rarely. It was just that one kingdom right before the Romans got there. What is that thing called? Hasmonean kingdom. That essentially was a very short time, like a blink of an eye in Jewish history. They used it. The way that they were allowed to kill, of course, it's all from Deuteronomy: stoning, burning, decapitating, and strangling, which they also they put crucifixion in with strangling. So hanging on a tree meant death by strangulation, and during the Second Temple period, this meant also crucifixion. So not just hanging by your neck by a rope, but also hanging off the cross. And then we finally get to Deuteronomy 21st chapter, which I think is really important for us to understand, if we're to understand the context of why the Jewish leaders were so obsessed with the fact that Christ had to be crucified. He couldn't die any other way. If a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. For a hanged man is accursed by God. Be attentive to that, please. A hanged man is accursed by God. You shall not defile your land, which the Lord your God gives you for an inheritance. So it was very important for the Jewish chief priests to see that Christ was hung on a tree, because a hanged man is accursed by God. So remember, they understood that something like this, or the wealth that you had, or whatever, it all was reflective of God, of God's blessing or curse on your life. And so because that was like the first century gospel, like Joel Osteen sort of preaches that prosperity gospel, right? Same idea. Whereas if something bad happened to you, you must be cursed by God. If you are blessed materially, then you must be blessed by God. And so this idea, I think, is very important. As we talked about, not a Christian idea, but this is something that was very, very widespread in the first century, both among the Jews and among the pagans. Okay, now an interesting little piece here. I thought that was, well, I want to read it too because I think it's good. So the Mishnah is the sort of Jewish rules, book of Jewish rules. One passage of the Mishnah surprisingly specifies that criminals who are stoned to death are then to be hanged afterwards, saying, and sages say, only a blasphemer and one who worships an idol are hung. So it says, hanging a corpse may seem pointless to us, but to Jews it reinforced the idea that God cursed and utterly rejected the wrongdoer. Hanging was the Jewish summa supplica, the ultimate penalty. So that, I think, very interesting, at least to me, about why this obsession about crucifixion, how the Romans used it, and why the Jewish priests and scribes were so stuck on the fact that the only way that Jesus Christ could die was by crucifixion. Why they themselves didn't decide to hang him, I honestly don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure anybody knows the answer to that, because they would consider that curse to be the same as crucifixion. But whatever, we may never know that. But in any case, they wanted the Romans to do that and to crucify him. I guess they figured it would be worse, and of course it is worse, because when we realize that it was only at the time of Constantine that crucifixion was banned by the Roman Emperor. We're talking about 300 more years after Christ's death. Plus, only Constantine banned it, and it's because he saw that it was inhumane. And he allowed only capital punishment by hanging, because from their point of view, that was the most instantaneous death. That was, although decapitation you could argue, might be less painful. Nonetheless, he felt that was appropriate. But crucifixion was used by the Romans until the time of Constantine, so more than 300 years after Jesus Christ's death. Okay, then we have a short conversation about divine justice and how the Romans looked at that. And it's actually very much the way that we look at that. Like if you think about a Roman play or a modern American movie, like he who is the villain must have a very bad death, right? You can't just die quietly in his bed from some disease. It has to be a very, very bad death. And that's the Romans. That's exactly how they felt too. That had to happen. That the evil person in the play, in this case, in the drama, had to have this very, very bad death. What I found really interesting in that conversation was just I don't think it's a throwaway sentence, but a small sentence. Roman justice expressed the triumph of the state. The ideal outcome was one where gods and men worked together to deal with miscreants. Roman justice expressed the triumph of the state. So that was very important to them. And I would say it's not unimportant to us, and our legal system in some ways is the same. So let's see what else we can talk about here. I think we talked about a lot. We talked about that. Yeah. Oh, the mocking. I thought that was interesting. I had no idea that was like a societal expectation surrounding crucifixion. So we hear about how the people mocked Jesus Christ while he was on the cross. And then they have this conversation between him and the two thieves, right? The good thief and the bad thief. The one also joins in and mocks him and so on and so forth. And the other one, Lord, remember me in thy kingdom. And he receives paradise. So that's all has to do with that time of the mocking. And apparently that was very widespread. It was like a societal expectation having being attached to crucifixion. So it wasn't just about the painful death and the fact that that was considered to be the death of a slave, and it was humiliating and so on and so forth. Also, there was this societal expectation that the person who was being crucified would be mocked by society. So as part of the humiliation of the death. Like, it's so foreign to us. It seems just crazy, but that was the way that they did it then. And so when we see Christ being mocked on the cross, this is not some random occurrence. This is something that was a societal expectation in the Roman Empire for sure. Well, we can only say for sure in the Roman Empire. We don't know about other societies which practiced crucifixion, but surely in the Roman Empire, this idea of mocking someone who was dying on the cross was considered to be like your duty as someone who lived in the Roman Empire. That's everything. I mean, that's not everything. I could talk ad nauseum for when I use Latin, although they were not using Latin then; they were using Greek. But in any case, I don't want to do that. I think we covered a lot of the really like major stuff of these two chapters. Very, at least for me, very interesting. Linda has her hand up, and I think we can have a conversation now if people have questions or comments. Go ahead, Linda.
Father, I was just wondering, after Jesus arose from the dead and the people were rising from their graves and the buildings were crumbling and things like that, what did Pontius Pilate think then? Is if he thought, could he be the God and he was afraid to crucify him? I just often wonder, what did he think when people were coming out of their graves?
I assume it was something like, I knew it. I knew it. I mean, I'm not. We don't know. We don't know because we don't have that information. As always, the scriptures include in them what we need for our salvation, and what's not necessary for our salvation is left out. So I guess that's not necessary for our salvation. But I assume it was something like, "Darn it, I knew that he was a god." I don't think he could have thought much more as a dedicated, pagan Roman governor. But surely he must have thought, yeah, I missed that one. Good question. Other questions about this or anything else that we've talked about in our book? Okay, so next week, okay, yeah, Linda, I'll turn off after we pray and say goodnight. You and I can continue on and talk about that question that you have. Okay, let's do that. All right, so thank you. I will do my best to enjoy my vacation. Next week, I'm in Chicago again. I think we need to try to have oh no, I'm not. I lied. Never mind. I'll go to Chicago. Maybe I will be. I don't know the answer to that, actually. I may be in Chicago. I still think we can have the meeting, and let's plan to do that. So let's read chapter 20 and plan to discuss it. If it turns out that that's just going to be impossible, then I'll let everybody know as soon as possible so that we're not frustrated by the fact that you're learning at the last minute. Yes, Marlene.
I just wonder what you will be doing in March. Come Great Lent, I would have to bow out if you continue on Wednesdays because of our Presanctified Gifts liturgies.
Yeah, so we also have Presanctified liturgy that begins right around 6 o'clock. So I think we have, I don't remember what I put on the syllabus, honestly. That would be nice if I did that. Let me quickly look and see if I can do it. Did I shift it to another night, or did I assume we were going to do it later? Let me just see. Syllabus. There we go. Okay. I'm sorry.
It looks like they
I can't
continue on Wednesdays.
Yeah, it looks like I thought we'd do it on Wednesday, which means I probably thought we'd do it after. That's probably not realistic, honestly. But when it's the middle of July and you're making such a schedule, it probably seems realistic. So I don't know the answer to.
Meal after pre-sanctified, so it'd be
8 o'clock.
Yeah, at least
late.
8 or 9 we'd be starting. That's probably not practical. Why don't folks? I'll send an email now and let's have a conversation about it. Essentially, the way our schedule works in Great Lent, I could do Monday or Tuesday nights. Thursday is not impossible, but Wednesday is not practical. Friday is not practical. Saturday, Sunday not practical. So send that out and we'll just kind of have a vote. Maybe I'll make a doodle,
Okay.
and folks can vote, and we'll try to figure it out. Okay, Lori, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Just Curious Flat is on Monday. Unless you're not doing it.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's true. Okay, well, probably Tuesday. Because we put all of the services for Wednesday on Wednesday, whereas the preparatory services for Friday pre-sanctified is on Thursday night. So, okay, I'll send out an email. Thank you for pointing that out. I'll send out an email and we'll vote and see if we can make it work. Excellent. Anything else that folks would like to talk about while we're together? All right. Well, I've enjoyed being able to be together tonight. So let's pray. And we'll say goodnight. And then Linda, you and I will have a conversation without the recording on about the wedding that's coming up. It is truly me to bless thee, the Theotokos, ever blessed and most blameless, and mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, beyond comparable glorious and the seraphim, who without corruption gave us birth to God, the word, the very Theotokos, thee do we magnify. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Very nice
you,
to
Father.
talk with you tonight. Bye-bye now.
Bye.